Crank length is an aspect of our bike that we very often overlook. In fact, it's entirely possible that many of you watching this might not even be aware of the crank length on your bike. And understandably so, because we're quite happy to ride whatever comes fitted to the bike in the first place. And yet crank length can affect how effectively we generate a pedaling force. Plus, it could be argued that crank length is one of the most important factors of a comfortable and efficient bike fit, behind, say, the very obvious of, say, our saddle height. And despite this, many of you might not even be aware that cranks do come in varying different lengths. So perhaps we should be paying more attention. And today I'm going to discuss why shortening our cranks could be important and delve into the benefits of having that shorter crank set on your bike. Right, then let's start with the basics. The crank length is measured from the center of the pedal axle all the way through to the center of the bottom bracket spindle here. Now these come in a range of size from as little as 160 mils and can go up to as much as 185 mils. But if I'm honest, they are mostly in a narrow band between 170 and 175 mils, always in increments of 2.5 mil. So if we take an average of that narrow band as 172.5 mils, sold as an average to most bikes here in the UK, which are pitched as suitable for a UK average height male, which would be 5 feet 10 or 177 centimeters, then we can deduce in simple proportional terms that our crank length could be 9.7% of our height. So using this as a guide and assuming average leg length proportion relative to your height, we can see that crank length should probably alter dependent on your height. And yet, referring back to that standard 172.5 crank that I talked about, which comes fitted as standard to effectively all bikes from as much as a 58 centimeter frame down to as little as a 52 centimeter frame, with only something like a 165 millimeter crank perhaps being found on very small female bikes, we can kind of see that the cycling industry's perhaps got stuck in the past, and effectively a lot of us are riding cranks that are perhaps too long for our bodies to cope with. So on the basis that our cranks could well be a little bit too long, what can we expect to find as a benefit to shortening our cranks? Well, first and foremost, most riders feel a general improved comfort from a shorter crank. And as a general rule, by shortening our cranks, there's usually a more powerful, smoother pedal stroke that comes from the crank and that improved comfort too. Indeed, this is a good place to point out that the crank length doesn't actually have any direct impact on our power output. Unless, of course, you are riding a single speed. And in that case, the crank length, or the longer the crank length, will help to generate more torque. But this is where gears come in, and they can offset any effect that that lever length, which is our crank, will have. And I don't really know any triathletes who are racing on a single speed bike. Indeed, the improvement in hip range is possibly the biggest advantage that shorter cranks brings to the table. The effect of crank length is felt the most at the top of our pedal stroke or the 12 o'clock position, where our knee is at the tightest of angles. And therefore, the knock-on effect is that the shorter the rider or the longer the crank, the tighter our knee is going to have to bend. So by default, the shorter the rider and the longer the crank, the less ideal a combination this is for the range of motion in our hips. More knee bend means the potential for knee pain, hip impingement, and even some lower back pain too. Plus, producing our peak power becomes more difficult the tighter that hip angle becomes. So the longer the crank, the bigger the potential there is for us to have a dead spot in our pedal stroke between 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock. Now, a further benefit to the shorter cranks, which a lot of triathletes are now becoming receptive to, is the fact that we can have some improved aerodynamics. Now, this is because, and is widely accepted by a lot of bike fitting professionals now, that the shorter crank can allow us to get our lower torso position due to our hips being in a more open angle, all because of those shorter cranks. Our saddle height is generally guided by the maximum leg extension we have at the bottom of our pedal stroke. So shorter cranks mean that we're going to have less extension by the value that we've shortened our cranks by. So hopefully that means you'll understand that we need to compensate for this shortening of our cranks by increasing our saddle height by that same value. However, all of that being said, ideal saddle height generally falls in a sweet spot or narrow window that can be a little bit too high or a little bit too low. Now hopefully you found this sweet spot either by trial and error or a proper bike fit. And the chances are that initially you won't need to alter your saddle height because you're in this narrow window or sweet spot range anyway. So a good suggestion would be to get a good few long rides in first before you even start to think about perhaps nudging your saddle up or down by small increments of say 2 to 3 mils. And finally, it has to be remembered that bike fitting is as much of an art as it is a science and doesn't really need to be rigidly stuck to, more guidelines to work from. So what are the benefits to be had from having a shorter crank? Well, our pedal stroke is going to be smoother and therefore hopefully more efficient. They'll also help us to maintain a higher cadence too. Plus, they're going to help us avoid that dead spot which can be found at the top of our pedal stroke between 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock. Plus, if you're suffering any knee, hip or lower back pain, this could be an indicator that your cranks are too long, so that could be a quick fix to that problem as well. Plus, there's little if not any evidence that taller riders are suffering injuries due to switching down to these shorter cranks. It really just comes down to a comfort thing or that perceived notion that I talked about earlier, that a taller rider necessarily needs to have a longer crank. Now, I don't know about you, but as someone who's always ridden a standard 172.5mm crank, just because they've always been fitted to my bikes, I for one feel pretty sold on this notion that the most logical decision is always to opt for a shorter crank. Now, if any of you have got any experiences or have shortened your cranks, please drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear about that. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, so please hit that thumb up like button. Don't forget, click on the globe to subscribe and get all the other videos that we've done. And if you want to see a video about race day mechanicals, you can get that here. And for tips on how to cycle faster, you can find that here.